As I was saying, David Joyce is a barrister. He's a campaigner for many years on the issue of travellers' rights. He's a colleague of mine on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, which has its detractors, and I wouldn't disagree with its detractors, but we are doing our best. And one of the things that we have done is to place in our strategic plan for the upcoming 3 years that economic, social and cultural rights will be our number 2 strategic priority. So it's the indivisibility of rights, and we are working to make sure that government put those rights at the centre stage. So that will be something that we will be lobbying the new government on. Anyway, back to David. David Joyce is our nominee also internationally on the management board of the Fundamental Rights Agency. And I may say that his contributions at the IREC meetings are always deeply incisive and important. And also he has the ability to slightly scare people in that he will just say, hold on a second, which I always think in a board you need somebody around the table who will say, hold on a second, what are we doing here? So without further ado, I'll introduce David Joyce.
Thank you very much, Betty. I'll try not to frighten you too much in the next 5 minutes. Again, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. And I was just saying to somebody earlier on, I came down with some thoughts that I wanted to kind of reflect on and just throw out. And then when I was in for the morning sessions, and then there's loads of other thoughts that come and hit me as well. So what I'm going to say in the next probably 5 or 10 minutes is not probably what I had intended to come along and say. So it is from learning, from listening to people, and probably maybe a little bit of what I wanted to say to begin with. I was asked sort of quite recently just by Nuala to come along and say something in the context of travellers and accommodation and ethnicity, and we looked at the title and trying to think, how do I put those 3 things together? And whilst I have obviously an interest and have a campaigning history around travel accommodation, my real interest is in housing for all. It's in the notion of housing as a right. You know, we kind of put it into the context. I suppose my experience comes from campaigning to have it realised for travellers, but the reality of what we're living in currently, and you know, it is 2016. We are 100 years down the road from I suppose a stage and we talk about revolution, we talk about change. I'm not sure there was ever really a revolution. I disagree with some of the historians perhaps on that, but the reality of what did come afterwards seems to have made things worse. We're back into a realm of families living in single rooms in tenements. Now, we're not calling them tenements, we call them emergency housing or kind of hotels, but we are talking about tenements. We're talking about families of 6, 7, 8, you know, living together almost in 2 or 3 generations in some cases in single rooms, and that's what families were doing up on well, particularly in the inner city, but like where I'm actually currently working, Francis Street, you know, one of the biggest slums in Europe in 1916, the largest tenement slum probably in the world at the time, were in a number of streets in the Francis Meath Street area, and that's where we're back to effectively. You know, we're talking, and the numbers are increasing. And I heard Aidan mentioned a minute ago, you know, there's no ideological will for housing at the minute from parties. It's not about an ideological will, there's an ideological hatred of providing social housing, of providing council housing. What we actually did quite well for nearly 100 years. We seem to have 10 years ago, perhaps, and a number of successive governments in the last while have said it's not ideological or lack of will, it's a hatred of the notion of housing for the working classes or for the poor or for those who can't provide for themselves. You know, I've listened to reports in the last while of housing conferences being held over the last 2 or 3 years, and last, you know, talking about the crisis, and even last week, you know, there was a housing meeting to deal with the crisis made up of developers, and apparently lawyers were brought in. No better people to solve social problems than lawyers. You know, what are the results? You know, developers and lawyers sitting in rooms talking about, you know, housing. They're not talking about social housing, they're not talking about housing for the poor. They're talking about housing for profit, and that's where we're at in this society. We haven't addressed, and it's not that we don't have a structure for housing. You know, as we have an experience of providing good quality housing over the years. Local authorities would have a major problem in one aspect, have done it. We need to get back to an ideological want as opposed to, you know, the hatred we have right now for council housing. And that's the context of housing and discussion housing. When we look at the notion of travellers and the provision of housing for travellers, and it only became a responsibility of councils, you know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that the provision of halting sites for the travelling community were part of their programme. But since, you know, the 1960s, there's been direct responsibility on local authorities, going back 100 years to the kind of various statutes and laws around the housing for the working classes, labourers, housing laws. That obviously were all subsumed into the responsibility of county councils. Travellers were not included in any of those at the beginning. Certainly the type of accommodation that travellers require and wanted was not included, and we're talking about halting sites or group housing schemes. It's only in the 1980s, after, when people talk about the courts, after a number of quite successful court decisions challenging the lack of provision by local authorities for the travelling community, that it became a statute requirement that local authorities were empowered to provide housing for travellers. In the 1990s, and towards the end of the 1990s with the Housing Travel Accommodation Act, there was a very specific programme put in place. And you know, you had requirements on councils to have traveller plans and traveller programmes. And we're into the fourth round of those programmes, and in the middle of the fourth round of those programmes we have something like Carrick Mines, which is indicative perhaps of a lack of not just planning, but almost, as I said, I think it's been said lots of times, almost and I'm going to use the word hatred, but certainly there's no real will to see the alternative type of accommodation that many travellers require as real accommodation. So we're put into and left in unplanned, and places like Carrick Mines, when you look at the layout of it, we're a death trap, and you know, was shock and, you know, disgust at the loss of 10 lives in Carrick Mines, you know, quite rightly expressed. It's a reality that was going to happen, unfortunately. It's going to happen for a number of reasons. Local authorities were completely failing in providing properly well-designed sites, and are continuing to do that, and even with an obligation on them. But the point being that the objections that, you know, have always come from the settled population towards the travelling community in terms of their housing have resulted in places like Carrick Mines. And, you know, I see it again with housing question generally, the whole idea of social housing, which we never talk about in terms of provision in this country. You know, I can easily name the reaction to traveller accommodation as for what it is, because I do feel it's racism. It's not just about NIMBYism, it's actually something different than NIMBYism. And we're beginning to see it now with social housing, and I know we can use the title NIMBYism, but it's actually an issue of class. You know, people do not want people who they see as a different class or an inferior class. And you know, as we talked about this in 100 years since 1916, that we're somehow throwing off, you know, one single class of nationalist Irish people, throwing off the shackles of the British oppressors. We weren't. We were replacing one system with another. And, you know, sometimes we forget as Irish people that we have a class system that we seem to be afraid to speak about. You know, and that's the reality of where we are right now. You know, listening to Aidan was quite interesting, because it sets out, you know, somebody earlier on this table said, you know, any breach of fundamental rights, any breach of provision in terms of areas, there's an international standard, there's an international law or convention that says it shouldn't happen, but the reality is it continues. And then we ask the questions why that's happening, and the reality is because there are various interests in society that obviously are vested against other interests, and the controlling interests are the ones that win out. And unfortunately, when we talk about, we can almost feel afraid to use the term class in the context of the current situation with housing, because it's not the wealthy that are losing their homes, even though, you know, some people have made bad mistakes in the Celtic Tiger area and put their homes at risk. But there's always been a situation of people who cannot provide, or from a demographic background, who have always been at risk of homelessness, and are now the ones who are homeless in our 2016 society. How that links to ethnicity, I mean, again, as I said, it's not something I'm going to argue for in favour of travellers, so I'm going to make an argument here for traveller ethnicity. It's something I've accepted, and certainly have accepted and realised since the reaction to Carrick Mines, both publicly and privately, that the characteristics of ethnicity for the traveller community exist and have always existed, and how people saw travellers as different and do see them as different in aftermath of Carrick Mines, you know, proves one of the kind of characteristics of ethnicity, that there are a group who, you know, are self-defined and are defined by others as different. You know, they fill other criteria in terms of a common and shared history, you know, common customs and language. Those things all fit the traveller community. You know, something that's been denied by the state has been a reality. And we're talking about in terms of 2016, you know, 100 years ago, travellers existed. They were in this country. And over that 100 years, even, you know, it's kind of handy to use the kind of a commemoration or a period to look at how were they treated. And they have been treated differently. And my interest, obviously, in law and looking at the law that has been used to treat travellers differently, which redefines their ethnicity in so many respects, has been one of negativity. It's only, as I said, in the late 1990s and perhaps in the early part of this century that a number of laws that you could say have been slightly positive towards the community have been enacted. But any laws that existed up until then have been negative, and have been negative in terms of the attack on the community, and they've clearly defined them as different. The classic example of that is the 1942 school attendance bill, which never became an act ultimately because it was knocked down by the Supreme Court, but was passed by both houses of the Oireachtas. And that particular act specifically identified travellers as a distinct group, effectively, to be dealt with differently in terms of education, in the context of education of their children, and put in place a statutory regime for the removal of travelling children from their parents. A summary removal, effectively, where it had a separate regime for the settled community. So, you know, even, you know, 20 years or 30 years after 1916, travellers were being clearly defined as a different subgroup within our society. The language of ethnicity was not being used, but certainly the actions of characterising communities and seeing communities as different was part of that. So that has happened in respect of education. You know, I'm not going to compare it to situations where, in reality, you know, the stolen generation of Aboriginal children in Australia were taken under very similar legislation. You know, it became right because it was law. But when it came to the context of traveller accommodation in that period of time as well, Sanitary Services Act 1939 specifically set out to remove and prohibit temporary dwellings, caravans and tents that travellers use as their means of accommodation. So there has been a kind of a period of you know, a history of law in the last 100 years, and, you know, I'm not going to go back into the sort of the legislation that existed from the British colonial period, but the law created by this state, a state that was founded on the principle of cherishing all the children of the nation equally. You know, some of the very strong social moves are made in terms of what Aidan has pointed out from 1919 and from the first declarations of equality in the state. I mean, you couldn't get a stronger statement that all children, all people will be treated equal and will have equal opportunities. That, you know, that couldn't be any stronger in any society, except that for some, and we'll always use the word some, and the reality of the Irish travelling community who existed and have existed in this country, you know, right through that period of time, has been completely different. So someone asked the question, you know, and with Michael, and I couldn't say much more than what Michael Farrell said earlier on in his intervention on the floor in respect of, you know, what are the issues currently in terms of human rights in Ireland, and for travellers, you mentioned travellers, but also, not just in that context, but also when you talk about, I suppose, the challenges in the period of time of ethnicity and the treatment of the travelling community. You know, it's clear that the state, for no reason, and I don't